Thank you. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome and the introduction. I'm humbled to be here with everyone. It was really encouraging and great to see where everyone is dialing in from. We see ourselves as very much a learning organization with New Sun Rising. You'll see later references to experiments and hypotheses. My background is actually in community health as a physical therapist. And in my journey in getting deeper with communities and understanding the needs of people really led us to the journey that I'm going to share with you through New Sun Rising. And so first and foremost, thank you to SOPAC, both for what they've produced in terms of the platform that's really helping us to achieve our goals, but also forums like this. So much of our journey as a sector, I believe, is really around shifting the culture and raising the awareness for best practices and the work that we're all doing and how measurement and data fit into that. And SOPAC's leadership in that area is impressive, and I'm really happy to be a part of that. So, and appreciate the opportunity to speak today. I am going to share these slides, so if we can get them sent out later, you don't have to worry so much about taking any notes. I will try to pause a bit for some questions along the way. We would certainly encourage people to put them into the chat as we're going through the presentation. And so the title of our conversation today is really around scaling social change and using collective impact to achieve that. And a lot of this has come to an understanding of how systems are being reorganized and how that reorganization can serve to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's near and dear to the mission of New Sun Rising and the work that we're doing. And to start just with some framing, we're really thinking about social challenges and the dynamic of understanding what's in front of us. And so we know social challenges are complex in nature. Our second truth is that we know that systems are organized. Systems, are not happening to come together in a, just sort of an organic way, although they do, but typically the systems that we're functioning within are organized and there's some intention behind them. So we need to understand how they're being organized. And then lastly, there's an equation that people plus money equals power. And so power is at play with everything we do, in particular, the changing dynamics of the organization of society and the organization of systems that we're working within. And so I wanted to start with this statement about what we're really up against here when we think about the challenges that are ahead of us. And that's really complex organized power. And so when we think about social change, we really need to understand these terms, we need to understand these concepts, and we also need to think about how they apply to our own work. Are we creating complex solutions? How well are we organized? And at the end of the day, how are we organizing our people and money to generate the power necessary to scale up our work? And starting with the concept of systems thinking, there's a group, FSG, which is out of the US and the West. They're a consulting group that's pushed out a lot of great materials and some toolkits around systems thinking. And they have 4 areas that are really characteristics to these complex systems and are really important in terms of the implications they have for people working within them. And the first characteristic is around context. And so in systems, contextual factors can really make or break the initiative. And so, we really can't just run headfirst into systems work. We have to understand the history of the context in which we're working. We have to understand cultural factors, social factors, and other key organizations that may be at play. The second factor is around connections. And so in systems thinking, and this is a really, really important point, that we live at within New Sun Rising, all of our investments are often looking at how we're making and enhancing more connectivity within the system. Often the relationships between entities are equally or more important than the work the entities are doing themselves. And so when you're thinking about collective impact and you're thinking about systems change, it's important to note that the emphasis and even the way you're allocating resources sometimes may look different from the work you've done historically. Third are patterns. And so in systems, cause and effect is not a linear process. It's often not predictable. Just when you think you figured something out, the different characteristics may change. And so at different levels of the system and in an ongoing way, you have to be constantly thinking about what patterns are emerging. And of course, data helps us to do that in a much more effective way. And lastly, our perspectives. Systems cannot be understood from any one perspective themselves. And so surrounding yourself not only with people who are seeing things your way or from your particular sector is super important. And that's why intersectional approaches where you're looking at government, you're looking at the for-profit and nonprofit sector and the community's role are so important to understanding a larger perspective to create solutions. And so within the social sector, and I'm speaking mostly from the nonprofit hat that I'm wearing right now, when we think about problem solving, I see a lot of constraints that we have in our own thinking that's very restrictive in the social sector. And often we're only looking at the people we surround ourselves, which often are other nonprofit folks or social sector folks, in terms of how we solve these problems. What we really like to do at New Sun Rising is apply two other questions to any problem that we're looking to address. One is, there is no secret that corporations and private markets have really figured out how to scale. We have multinational, multi-billion, dollar organizations, as evidence of that. And in nature, there's a field of biomimicry that leans upon the 3.8 billion years of wisdom that natural systems have adapted and emerged from. And so we like to ask these two questions of problems that we have, both how does business solve this and how does nature solve this, to get outside of our bubble of simply nonprofit thinking. When the biomimicry movement looks at flocks of birds and things that come together, you start to understand things that actually can apply to your collective impact or your systems approach as well. There was a study around flocks of birds done by this computer programmer and really pulled out in his modeling these three themes that actually allow birds to flock and to avoid collisions with each other. This understanding of how far it is from its neighbor, or this idea of separation, the way that the birds will actually orient themselves to that of their neighbors, this idea of alignment, and then also maintaining the structure of the flock itself, which has some benefits to efficiency in terms of cohesion. So you can think about things, within your own work or within multi-organizational collaboratives you're working in, these concepts of separation, alignment, and cohesion, and potentially pull things out of what the natural environment's telling us. We also see a lot in schools of fish where there's a protective aspect of this. There's efficiency and also an awareness in knowing what your neighbor is doing. And then the last example here from nature are families of elephants, where there's support in collective measure or collective work. There's communication that's increased and enhanced by this. And actually there's a reduction of stress, and I can definitely share that myself. Being in partnership with your peers or other organizations certainly creates a network of support that can act as a stress reducer. When we think about businesses and corporations, I often think about this functional alignment. And so we have, the ability for many businesses to work in harmony with each other from a producer to a logistics company to a retailer service. And the market has aligned them in a really effective way, which has resulted in growth. We know that competition can strengthen what's being delivered, between different organizations. And I like to use this example of Amazon and thinking about, this miracle that you could be laying in bed, with your cell phone in your pajamas and press a button and a package could show up on your door the next day. And to think about all of the steps that need to be in place, that functional alignment that has to occur from the technology to the order fulfillment to the delivery itself. When I think about the social sector, I challenge people to think about some similar examples. How are we structuring ourselves in a way that has that level of efficiency that actually achieves our goals? And I think in many ways we're falling short in this collective impact approach. So this begs the question, if collaborative solutions to complex challenges are so beneficial, then why aren't they more developed in the social sector? And the truth, just like the problem itself, is very complex, and our relationship as a sector with these collaborative types of solutions often comes back to resource availability. I know in our region, it's sometimes difficult to actually get the funding or the resources required to build out collective impact or collaborative models. Investors often don't quite understand the value proposition of investing in multi-organizational initiatives. Our thinking itself, so some of what I talked about earlier and kind of getting outside of the bubble or the silo, I believe we're self-restricting in that way. Just our history and the personality. So, there are often times where organizations maybe have history or communities have history that can be difficult to overcome and to actually become into relationship with each other to achieve a goal together. And then lastly are the lack of exemplars in collective impact work. And so as a relatively new field, we just don't have many great examples that we can point to and look around and model ourselves after, although they are out there. And so with part of this conversation, I wanted to talk a bit about this, a case study and this idea of looking at Pittsburgh as an investment and social impact case study. And so myself, I was sharing this a little bit earlier with the SOPAC team. My grandfather immigrated to America from Poland in the early 1900s. He landed here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is located in southwestern PA. And so the interesting thing is the city's important role in the industries that really helped to build America. And so there are various phases where Pittsburgh was the world leader in manufacturing anything from steamboats to vehicles to glass, steel, which is what we're best known for due to the role in sort of the early part of the century with the world wars, and then also now being known more for technology. And so Pittsburgh has this kind of interesting approach based on the wealth that predated our current times, but also our ability to see what that impact of those investments has been. And so looking at these legacy systems, many of which were extractive, we can see what the impact or what the return on investment was in those approaches. And so we really wanted to understand, how has Pittsburgh's history of organizing our people and money solved or created socioeconomic challenges? And just to remind you that people and money equals power. So at the end of the day, we've taken our money and we've organized our people to generate power that has resulted in some sort of impact. And I wanted to walk through some of those with you today. We've had generally what are referred to as three renaissances in the Pittsburgh region. Renaissance 1 was more of an urban renewal. This looked at really investments from a federal level through the federal government's homeowners loan corporation. And this happened between 1935 and 40, which kind of set up this Renaissance one. Folks are familiar with the Fair Housing Act or any sort of the history of redlining in America. Essentially what happened here was that the investments that came from lending institutions and the government itself were restricted to only go into certain communities. Large projects were also invested in, such as our many of our public recreation facilities, our performance theaters, and our sports stadiums, and some large industry also came into the region and built a lot of our downtown corridor. Renaissance 2 is termed as our eds and meds phase. So our mayors invested over $4 billion in industry that defined us and continues to define us, our hospital systems, the cultural trust, and our university systems. And so moving into where we are now, which really started in the 90s, is this Renaissance 3 around innovation. We are heavily invested in advanced manufacturing, robotics, artificial intelligence, really the next wave of, of our workforce and economy. And while all of this is at the surface positive, we all like to see investment into our communities. The question we always have to ask ourselves is, when we're committing this amount of money and predetermining who the winners are going to be in these types of scenarios, there are certain results that occur of that, and there's certain power structures that are created. The last one I wanted to call out here in the bottom right is the fracking industry. So southwestern Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia sits on one of the largest deposits of petros in the world. And so there's been a lot of fracking of the natural gas here and related industry that's popping up, namely a large cracker plant that's taking that natural gas and planning to turn that into plastics. So looking at this legacy of disinvestment, so the money went somewhere, right? I just gave you the kind of history of a good 60-year history of investment in Pittsburgh. What was the result of that in terms of the actual people that have lived here? And so this redlining map shows the neighborhoods in Pittsburgh that were deemed not investable by the federal government and the folks that were making these determinations. So they received no investment over this time. And as I go through these three slides, what you'll notice is that those areas that had the disinvestment in the early part of the century, today in 2020, have the highest levels of poverty, have the lowest levels of vibrancy, the lowest quality of life measures, decreased life expectancy. And so, again, thinking about investments we're making, how people and money are organized, and really what the impacts show, is that over time, we can draw this clear lineage between our history of disinvestment and really investment into extractive industries, and what today are the remnants of those investment decisions. Pittsburgh on the left is often quoted as one of the most livable cities in America. We often hear this, even globally, that it's a destination, tourism destination, and that is all true. There are great things, and this is not intended to throw shade at our city and our region, but we have to understand the facts if we're going to really think about who's benefited and how they've benefited. So on the left, we see, massive amounts of investment into and exits related to workforce and entrepreneurship, a great hospital system, and in some ways around energy and water, us actually exceeding some of our regional goals. But on the right, a study that was released here over the past year, where Pittsburgh actually scored, and I didn't know that there was such a thing as an F+. I thought it was just, if you failed, you failed, but apparently we were just above the line of a pure failure when it comes to equity. But looking at workforce, looking at business ownership, food security, infant mortality, air quality, all of these things actually worsened over the period of time that this study was done. And this is, relatively recent. This isn't looking at a 5-decade history of Pittsburgh. This is looking over, a much shorter period of time in recent history here. So we have to continue to ask ourselves, if we're so wealthy in terms of investments, if we're so wealthy in terms of philanthropy, if we have these great civic amenities, why are so many people not thriving? And why are so many people still failing within the system? And this has come to be known as the tale of two Pittsburghs, where these persistent racial inequities indicate that as we are continuing to grow, opportunities are not equally shared. They call out this fragmented governance and planning, which I think is part of what we're talking about with collective impact, trying to address that. And that these inequities and that fragmentation actually inhibits efforts to try to address those challenges. At the bottom there, you'll see some really stark statistics that white women actually live 15 years longer than Black men in Pittsburgh. Black women make roughly half of every dollar made by white males, and that Black women are 5 times more likely to live in poverty than white males. And so when we take a step back from this case study, we really have to scratch our heads and ask ourselves, if we can see what the return on investment is by continuing to invest in legacy systems that are built on our history, built on extractive industries, or do we reorganize our systems and work to scale up new models? And certainly, we feel this, I believe. I know in this country and across the world, there's a movement underway in terms of how we're valuing things in our societies, what economic models look like, and we really want to continue to be a part of this reorganization and helping people to learn and understand from the work that we're all doing together. And so for the past 15 years, we at New Sun Rising have been running a series of these community economic development experiments to test a hypothesis. And what our assumption is that organizing local people and money around their shared goals will continue to generate more significant economic growth, environmental resilience, and reduced inequalities than the existing systems. And so we really want to hold this up. It's not so much about reforming an existing system as it is transitioning toward a more just system. And we really believe that not only the environmental impact and the equality or equity can be achieved, but that we don't have to sacrifice economic growth for that as well. We feel that we can do that in tandem. And so the question, I want to use some time now to share a little bit more about how New Sun Rising actually disrupts these extractive systems, and how are we actually working to scale up these regenerative, vertically integrated systems? How do we connect grassroots, intermediaries, and more of the traditional systems approaches? And at the very base value, we do 2 things. The first of which is we strengthen nonprofits and small businesses. We do this through workshops, incubators, accelerators, all of the ways that folks I'm sure are familiar with, to help support people at different stages of growth. Our capacity building framework revolves around these 4 areas of planning, resources, connectivity, and identity. The second primary role New Sun Rising serves is around accessible funding. And so we know the majority of people that we support are not eligible for institutional investment for various reasons. And so we are working to actually ourselves deploy grant, loan, award, debt security, equity, any way that we can be creative in deploying our resources to decrease the access gap that we know exists for the people that we're serving. We're actually partnering right now with the Heron Foundation out of New York and some small support of Wells Fargo on a participatory capital pilot. So this is where we're centering the community actually in the investment decisions that are made. And another hypothesis there that we feel the community itself, the wisdom, the relationships in a community will actually produce greater returns than an outside entity doing that underwriting. And so as a result of capacity building, as a result of investment, we're generating these net positive social impacts. And I like to be a realist and state that we know that every entity, I don't care how well-intentioned you are, has some negative impact on our consumption, whatever that may be. But what we're looking at here is driving as much of a net positive impact as possible. And we've bucketed these three areas of culture, sustainability, and opportunity. And we've aligned each of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals with those three areas. And at the end of the day, we're really looking for improving the quality of life in these disinvested communities, driving sustainable growth, helping to retain local talent. We often know that people who are successful often will leave these communities, which has a generational effect. We want to promote successful models and help to lift them up more regionally so that they can scale, and then also help to embed the knowledge and networks within communities so that they can be self-determined. So this, at the end of the day, is not about what New Sun Rising learns or what we do. It's really about centering the community to be self-determined, both to lead and benefit from the growth. And so in 2017, New Sun Rising released the first version of our Vibrant Communities framework. This is built on the practical experience that we've had over the past 15 years, looking at capacity building and investment and community development strategies, and outlines 18 different strategies that are best practices for equitable, sustainable development. And we've bucketed these across three phases: Ignite, Launch, and Grow. And the first phase, Ignite, is really focused on building this foundation. So whether it's an individual organization or a more broader geographic approach, it's really helping understand your assets, the relationships you have. In our place-based approach, this typically lasts a year or longer. So this is really our discovery phase, if you will, helping to produce data that helps to identify the priorities and the local talent that certain communities have. It also helps to generate hope and trust and a shared sense of identity for the communities that are being served. And our partner communities, roughly have twice the county average in terms of the level of poverty experienced, and the household median income is roughly 60% of the average. So these are pretty high need communities, and definitely as a result of that disinvestment that we talked about earlier. We've developed this Vibrancy Index to help us do comparative assessment between different neighborhoods. And so this is just an example of 5 different neighborhoods, Shady Side being a more well community that's has high levels of investment, and the other communities listed having reduced levels of investment over time. But looking at how they compare across these areas of culture, sustainability, and opportunity, and realizing that they can be 40 to 65% lower sometimes in these publicly available data sets that we're bringing together into these indices. With the Ignite phase, a lot of this is deep community engagement. We're doing a lot of human-centered design work. We're doing a lot of listening, using arts and creativity, working a lot with our artist partners and creatives to come up with really great ways to connect people and to more deeply understand where they're currently at. So this readiness assessment helps to look at both any historic plans or historic priorities that have been identified, brings new data in. The community actually helps to structure that data and identify what its priorities are. We do a lot of resource or asset mapping, understanding the relationships between current actors and organizations. And then this culminates into sessions where we're actually understanding from the community what its development priorities are. And that's deeply important. We want to make sure that over time we're supporting both single organizations and collaborations that have shared priorities with the community. These result in documented action plans that memorialize the work and make sure that everyone has a common language and has some accountability to what's happening. And then this phase, this Ignite phase, ends with identification of who's working on solutions or potential solutions that are addressing those needs. So we run these Ignite workshops, which for many of you might have participated in hackathons or startup weekends, very kind of similar flavor to what we do in our Ignite workshops. The second phase is really about building the ecosystem. So after we've gone through this discovery phase and learned more about the priorities and who's working towards those priorities, then we're looking at actually launching organizations, both for-profit, nonprofit. We always say we're agnostic to the legal entity type. We work with cooperatives and everything in between to really mobilize progress that's addressing the challenges or priorities that were set forth by the community. We do this through resident workshops. So we actually do incubator programs for resident-led initiatives as well. We do this, Vibrancy funds work, which I had mentioned earlier, looking at how can we mobilize all of the financial resources at our hand to redistribute them back out into the community in various ways. And this Vibrancy funds investment underwriting is a tool that we developed. So regardless of who we're deploying funds to, we're actually underwriting them in the same way, whether that's a loan or a grant. And we're tagging each of those investments with these 6 factors. And so we want to know what type of organization is it legally on a spectrum from nonprofit to for-profit. What is the type of impact investment, everywhere from a grant to a market rate loan? What is the expected financial return? What is our risk assessment, which drives a lot of the lending rates that we're offering? We have our own Vibrancy score, so we've utilized our framework to create a way to actually score the applicants themselves. And then lastly, tagging them with the SDGs that they're working on. And so you'll notice this throughout. Every piece of data we're collecting is tagged with the SDG in some way. And the product we're working on now, which I'll speak to at the end here, is primarily focused on the integration of those data sets and allowing us new insights. At the bottom of this page, there is a link, newsunrising.org. If you look for the Vibrancy Funds Impact Investment Report, you can get more detail on what our portfolio looks like. And there's actually a more detailed sheet that references this investment underwriting criteria. So after we've done this Ignite phase work and we're moving towards these investments, we formally bring people together into a 12-month program that looks like very much traditional incubation from a social impact lens. And so it's business planning, startup capital, strategic connections, and probably most importantly, building this peer network of people who share a commitment, they share a geographic location, and the relational capital that's exchanged there is probably as valuable as anything else that happens. By investing in people, and these are folks that have participated in an incubator process that we had over a couple of years. These 18 people, as a case study, there was a little over $1 million invested. That's both through New Sun Rising and outside capital. That was leveraged for over $7 million of income earned and additional investment generated, over 130 jobs created, maintained. You can see the economic ROI and the job creation numbers. And so, while we often find ourselves really focused on the social impact, I think to scale this work, we have to continue to make the economic case for what we're doing to drive more investment. And so with the support of these different entities, you know, we are again tagging them with the UN SDGs, and this is, you know, just one version of how we might look at this. You know, this gives us a sense of which SDGs our portfolio is most directly addressing, which are maybe, you know, less invested in, and gives us a chance to just question where we're putting our money and how we're investing and whether that's really aligned with the impact that our communities have prioritized. The third phase, between 2015 and 18, we did see tremendous growth and progress with our first two phases. So the Ignite and Launch phase strategies went really well, but we also started to realize more clearly that these legacy systems that we've talked about were not designed to support equitable, sustainable growth. And so we really were finding more difficulty funding and financing some of these initiatives, finding ways to scale them up over time because they were attempting to grow within a system of power that really needed to be reorganized. And so that shift in many ways requires existing power structures to either share their power or relinquish their power. And we know that power is often not relinquished easily. And so this question about how we orchestrate this just transition led to, in late 2018, an identification and a design of this program internally that we refer to as Get Cool, but it's growing impact through data and collaboration. And so those joint strategies are what we've really been focusing in on to scale social change. The four pillars of our integrated data platform that we're bringing together, the first are the community indicators. So we want to know and understand you know, what's actually happening in the communities that you're working to serve. The second are the impact metrics. What are the organizations doing to address those? The third is health and resilience. And so that's looking at the organization or the collaborative itself. How healthy is it? What type of capacity does it have? Where maybe it has some need for additional support. And then lastly, and this is really kind of an ongoing thing, is the stakeholder and beneficiary data. So really continuing to understand the impact of the people on the ground. The first lens here, this is our Vibrancy Index dashboard. And so we created this with a fellowship program through some universities and have built this out to look at Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is located, and allows you to compare and contrast different census tracts in different neighborhoods, and also toggle on and off the different SDGs that you're interested in. So you have the ability to look at the communities that you're serving or potentially communities that are looking for support. You can turn on and off combinations of different SDGs. So maybe you're interested in hunger and poverty. It will actually show you where that community is performing in context of the rest of the county. And then it actually gives you the raw data as well. So you can port that and use that in different ways. I'll share that link separately and folks can kind of work through that if they're interested in learning more. Our relationship and research around how to actually organize impact data for individual organizations and portfolios led us to our relationship with SOPAC. And so our ability to tag all of our data through the lens of the UN SDGs, but then also organize organizations into portfolios and sub-portfolios that represent these collective impact initiatives. SOPAC allows us to do all of that seamlessly and also gives us the ability to aggregate and share that data. And so we're, you know, just on the front end of this relationship, but it's been a really great thought partnership and exchange of ideas on both sides. And we're, you know, super excited about what we're starting to generate through the impact metric data and how the SOPAC data platform is allowing us to communicate that out to continue to advocate for these organizations. We have an organizational assessment tool that we use for this health and resilience data. And then lastly, that stakeholder and beneficiary aspect. We're also working with SOPACT through Impact Cloud to start to gather that client data, that beneficiary data. We're also working with 2 other applications that we have relationships here in Pittsburgh to find ways to actually democratize data collection and allow the community to be contributing to these insights in a more regular way. When we talk about collective impact, which is one of our strategies in this grow phase, we are building off of and interpreting the collective impact forums model. And so there are 5 conditions of collective impact that I'll go through briefly here with you. On the right are representation of some of the collective impact initiatives that we are supporting. We have supported 9 collective impact initiatives over the past 2 years, representing 36 different organizations. And we're still applying that same base support through capacity building and accessible funding to these initiatives. It just looks different when you're working with collective impact. Something else that we like to draw attention to is, as individuals, leaders, capacity building organizations are moving through these grassroots, intermediary, and systems level, the type of leadership actually changes, and the skills and knowledge that they have changes as well. And so I won't spend too much time on this slide. You can unpack it a bit when we send it to you, but important to recognize that the support you're providing, the training you're providing needs to shift based on the strategy that you're actually deploying. The first one of the collective impact strategies is around establishing a common agenda. And so for your initiative, first and foremost, it's important that everyone is on the same page with what your purpose is. And so we have a number of approaches here, research, looking at different agendas, aligning with the UN SDGs, understanding and defining your goals, all to collectively define the problem you're seeking to solve and a shared vision to solve it. It might seem simple, but I see this overlooked, and too often there's an assumption that people are seeing things the same way and actually defining them differently. The second, which we've talked a good bit about today, is this idea of shared measurement. So understanding what the norms are for you to come together around your data, looking at baseline data, leading indicators, understanding how you're going to collect that and store, which we're working with SOPACT on, both for individuals, but also for the collective impact initiatives themselves. And then this idea of just asking questions of the data through regular synthesis and communication. The third strategy of collective impact are mutually reinforcing activities. So this is the what, what are you doing collectively to address these, thinking about different leverage points and activities that the partners can pull together to achieve those goals. The fourth is around the backbone itself. And there's a little bit of a misnomer with this concept of a backbone. Often in the collaboratives we're working with, there's not a separate standalone organization that is the backbone. Often backbone roles are being shared across many aspects of the larger collective itself. But these are important functions that, unless they're specifically called out and the roles are understood, often end up falling by the wayside, and collaboratives have a risk of failing. So a lot of that is around the data collection and resource mobilization, policy work, those types of things. And lastly, of the 5 is continuous communication. And this probably doesn't need much more, but it's really, really important. Most collaboratives that we're working with are meeting either every other week or every month. It often has taken a year to 18 months for any of those collaboratives to actually get to action. And I would say that this continuous communication is the only way to get through building that trust, relationship, understanding that allows you to actually make collective impact on your issue area. This example is from one of the collaboratives we're working with. This is just a way that we're visualizing a lot of what I just told you. The Partnership Network, very creative name. I kept telling them we need to come up with a name before this sticks, and that was 2 years ago, and we're still the partnership network. But this is a community development network that's working on a lot of these SDGs, 1, 8, 10, 11, and 17. You can see here in the middle how we're talking about collecting data and then actually analyzing that data, and then moving to the right, using that data to move towards collective action together. And so we're committed to aligning our resources, creating transparency, and actually sharing these outcomes more broadly. I referenced earlier this integrated data portal. This is a tech platform that we're working on as well that actually integrates the 4 different aspects of the data sources that we referred to as our pillars. And we're also looking at how we support leaders through the use of this portal. So individuals, portfolios, all the folks that we're working with to increase their impact through data storytelling and more of that collaborative approach. So in summary here, what have we learned through New Sun Rising, and where are we going? And just to share a few bullet points as we move towards some Q&A to wrap things up. This idea of integrating grassroots, hyperlocal work with intermediaries and more systems. What are the leverage points within this work to actually build the power necessary to scale social impact? And so the first is that, it's just a very straightforward statement. These systems need redesigned. We are continuing to see pushback against certain things that are being promoted, that redesign is really necessary, and that fragmentation hyperlocally and regionally is really restrictive to the ability to scale this. So we need to understand more about how we're in relationship with each other, how we actually pull things together, how we organize our people and money to generate that power. Reframing changes mindsets, and we have some partners that are doing this really well. New Sun Rising's trying our best, but we probably need to do more about this too. But this idea of mindset being the most powerful thing that actually holds these systems in place. How do we reframe and get people to think differently so that they can see themselves in the solution? Making sure that accessibility is there. Often it's the most important thing to whether people are thriving or succeeding, is whether they have access to the resources, knowledge capital, social networks necessary. Being more innovative around funding and financing. And then the use of data and technology. We know that the social sector is vastly underutilizing this. We also think that collective impact hinges on the ability for us to scale up these data and technology systems. So with that, I know we didn't leave a ton of time for Q&A, but I did want to turn it over to the SOPAC team to see if there was anything shared in the chat that we could talk through.
Great, Scott. What a great presentation, actually. It's so much to think and so much to digest. And I'm looking at this chat and seeing that we have a super global crowd today, people joining from all the way India to Germany to Denmark, and I don't think I've gone through everything. I'm sure we do have quite a few questions. One quick one that I can ask that I saw in chat, and I think Lorna can probably ask more from the Q&A. I see one that the Kaija Lensberg is asking about, do you see any negative effect in gentrification or neighborhood by development that occurred through your process? We can start with that. I think I will ask Lorna to ask more. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that question. And we absolutely start with that point in mind, that gentrification and displacement are a huge risk, and often are the models that we're trying to learn from so that we can actually design against them. That being said, at the end of the day, the market itself determines the market and ownership over the physical infrastructure determine the direction of these communities. And so, sometimes it can happen very rapidly where we're simultaneously working on filling Main Street vacancies in these neighborhoods. And within 2 years, you start to see, prices rapidly rising, both for commercial and for residential property. And so we also support initiatives like land trusts and land banks. We're doing a lot within equitable housing and equitable, business districts to try to stabilize some of that. But we've actually found that a lot of these disinvested communities have been, the property's been acquired already. And so for, one particular incubator that we ran, 6 of the businesses were looking for real estate, and 4 of them could not find anything in that community because a speculator had already bought up all of that property and was not interested in actually seeing it appreciate. They were using it to write off losses, and were just waiting for the community to flip so that they could sell them for a higher rate. So that gentrification and displacement is always top of mind for us. We're relatively early. We're only about 4 years in. I would say the most mature community we're in, Millvale, is seeing increased housing prices, increased, Main Street business districts. And so driving local ownership and making sure that people are moving into an ownership position as early as possible, is something that we promote. But I appreciate that question for sure. It's a very high risk of everything we're doing.
Thank you, Scott. I see another very interesting question, which is, where do you see funding for collective impact work come from? So basically, who pays for it?
That was the question I was going to ask you all. I will say that we've had more traction having this conversation nationally with larger funders that maybe don't have such a geographic focus or alignment. So in the Pittsburgh region, a lot of our funders are place-based funders. And so collective impact initiatives sometimes, well, they do by definition scale multiple geographies. And so it's sometimes outside of their, their funding model to support those. So we've had more traction nationally to talk about this. The Collective Impact Forum, we're part of a national accelerator there. They've been really helpful in helping to think through different funding mechanisms and ways that these are put together. So I would encourage you to reach out to them as well. And then lastly, at New Sun Rising, we ourselves try to be innovative and entrepreneurial as a nonprofit. And so we highly value generated revenue, whether that's through consulting. Our Vibrancy funds, we actually take an administrative fee to manage those funds on behalf of different organizations. All of that comes in as unrestricted capital, which really at the end of the day allows us to do a lot of the high risk things that we're doing, is having our own funding sources that we're generating and are relatively unrestricted. The last thing I would say is having a risk tolerant board of directors helps too. So our board is amazing and really supports us to be innovative and push things forward.
Great. Actually, we have quite a few questions and do have a couple of minutes. So I'll actually ask the next one. I think Dave Kumar is also asking that how much do you work with researchers and university initiatives like a Carnegie Mellon? And if so, what are some of the greatest challenges to collaborating with them, with that kind of stakeholders? Any pleasant surprises?
Yeah, we work in regular partnership with the universities. Each university, I feel, has a certain core competency and a different DNA. So for us, the University of Pittsburgh has a strong social service and health system backing. So often they're coming at projects from a different lens, from a data collection standpoint, looking more at the social determinants of health and other aspects. From Carnegie Mellon, obviously has really, really strong programming in terms of data analytics and databases and more the technical side of this. So we do work with them in different ways. the challenges I see in working with the universities, one is that typically these are relatively short-term projects. And so we know our work has a much longer arc than a single semester of school. So the carryover between student teams can be challenging sometimes. When we're doing more community immersed data gathering, it can be challenging for university students to come into disinvested communities and really have the time to understand that context and build relationships and trust. And so data collection sometimes can be challenging when we're working with universities in that way. So we've just continued to navigate that and play to the strengths, both to make sure that they're having a great experience and, you know, ultimately our communities are getting what they need out of it.
No, absolutely. I think I do see that. And I think that does kind of pile up on one of the other questions that Michaela is asking, like, what challenges do you face with collecting and measuring qualitative data to understand the impact? And I think, like you said, I mean, impact is not a short term, and you really have to kind of have a continuous monitoring intention and everything placed in to be able to kind of listen to your stakeholders all the time.
Yeah. If I could add to that real quickly, you know, one of the data norms that the partnership network that I referenced came up with was that we as a collective defined that data is not the end, it's the means to the end. And so at the end of the day, collecting data is not going to solve anything. I hate to say that. I hope SOPAC's not mad at me for saying
No,
that.
absolutely.
The numbers themselves are not going to solve your problems. It's really how you organize and how you're continuously interrogating that data, having conversations around the data, who's a part of those conversations, and how do you feed forward into refinements, whether that's from an investment standpoint or from a program delivery. So that CQI, that continuous quality improvement, embedding that within your collective impact initiative and making data interrogation and collection a part of your culture is super important.
No, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head, because I do think that if you're not learning from your data to make your decisions, that data is just not valuable to the organization at all, actually. So that definitely is what close to our heart as well. So we're kind of getting to 10 o'clock, and I think we have a few questions, which I think I can probably have them answered offline. We would love to kind of close and I think go on to this one, but thank you so much, Scott, for making the time, and I think in enlightening us, and I think challenges and the solutions that New Sun Rising is actually putting to have this collective impact initiative. It's just definitely very valuable to everyone who has joined today. And I think there are many more who has not been able to join today, are looking forward to having this recording. So we'll be doing that. So I heartily thank you from SOPAC team. Just to have a little bit of a conversation, we may have another one webinar coming up next month, I think November 18th, where Veronica from Rockefeller Foundation and Jane Reisman will be also, I think, touching some of the similar topics like impact management norms and how to kind of put them into practice. So look out for that. And with that, thank you. And we will see you all again. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Yeah, thank you all. And I look forward to connecting hopefully down the road with folks. I know there's a lot of questions, so hopefully we'll have another opportunity to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you kind of have this journey that we would love to kind of reconnect periodically and see how it's going. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye.
Bye now.